Hey there. Well, I promised I'd go into a little more depth about inclusion, and I wanted to point out a few things which a number of well intentioned companies are doing that I think you can and really should do better with. So here's the deal: a lot of common practices to boost inclusion are popular, but not necessarily impactful or even sometimes remotely beneficial towards building inclusion. So, I want us to examine and deconstruct some of those practices today and realistically over the next few weeks. You see, there are so many things to point out. This is going to be a mini series in itself. But today, we are going to look at the assessment side of things. So, you can't actually assess anything you haven't first defined. So, when you jump into D&I and you're trying to boost something or improve something, you need to first consider what it is you are trying to look at and assess. What is the thing that you want to improve? And then define that specifically in terms of what it is you can measure in that to impact on it and see if you are actually, in fact, improving it. So, when we're talking about assessments, it's important to first discuss definitions. Because one way companies are sabotaging their D&I efforts from the beginning is by not being clear about what they mean by diversity or inclusion. In fact, the first issue I want to point out today is that in assessments, many companies are actually conflating diversity and inclusion. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying this to minimize the topic of diversity at all. Let me clarify here. You see, when I'm looking to assess diversity, I'm primarily looking at two things, and that's the presence and positions of various minority and marginalized groups within a company. Now, those are great things. In fact, they're essential things, and don't get me wrong, I want you to look at those. But I also want you to look deeper into inclusion. Inclusion, I consider as going beyond which groups you have where in your organization. My definition is focused on how it is for people once they're there. Thus, if you share that definition with me, we are going to be assessing some very different things than what we would if we were just focusing on diversity. And I know some say inclusion is concerned with the concept of belonging, and I think that's true. But I like to break inclusion down into more specific considerations, like the internal awareness, enablement, empowerment, actions, influence, ownership, and impact related to your employees and stakeholders. Yeah, that's a lot, I know, but all of those considerations are definable, quantifiable, and able to be followed over time, if you know how to measure them. Not sure if you do? Well, that's the second problem I want to talk about today. So, let's be honest here. What exactly have you been looking at when you're looking at inclusion? And what do you want to accomplish through assessing your inclusion? Okay, are you assessing, for instance, inclusion issues as reported? Or maybe minority sentiment, how minorities feel they're being included in your company? Is that your focus? Okay, well, I want you to know, though, that in looking at reported issues and sentiment, you're looking at symptoms, not systems of exclusion, and symptomatic metrics only have marginal value. So let's take it back to your definitions and assessment goals, Remember, inclusion for me is looking at awareness, enablement, empowerment, actions, influence, ownership, and impact related to your employees. So for that kind of inclusion, your KPIs and OKRs should go beyond feelings and minority presence and have metrics that keep track of things based in observable behaviors, actions, and outcomes as well. And, by the way, observable is a key concept here, because another way your inclusion efforts are falling flat is through using the wrong methodology. So, did your inclusion assessment basically consist of a survey and maybe interviews asking for minorities to tell their inclusion-related problems? Okay, yeah, that's actually pretty common. But as we kind of already indicated, that's actually more chasing symptoms than actual systems or syndromes to be addressed. So let's consider why that falls short and what kind of methodology you'd actually need to get to the bigger picture. In focusing on minority groups and asking them to tell you their problems they perceive, in fact, what you've done is limited your insight to minorities with the time and bandwidth to go into this, those with the belief that speaking up in this context is actually safe and impactful, and even further, you've narrowed it down to those with specific and pre-existing awareness of how they're currently being excluded. Now, that's actually narrowing it down to a very small group. And don't get me wrong, those are very, very important things to ask, and that's a very, very important group of people to engage, certainly. But understand that in doing so, you're actually not getting a full picture of your organizational inclusion. You see, unfortunately, most marginalized groups don't know the full extent of how excluded or marginalized they are. As an example, most female employees don't know exactly how much their male colleagues are earning for the same work. They may not know they're being underpaid or to complain about that because of a lack of knowledge. And similarly, people are not generally aware of the number or full extent of the back channel conversations they're left out of. So, by definition, excluded people cannot fully know the degree to which they're being excluded. It's a truism. You cannot fully know what you don't know. This is why your methodology cannot be fully dependent on self-reporting. You must also have observations. You must also examine digital, communicative, and in-person behavior. You have to analyze internal data on salaries, opportunities, development. You've got to look at the facts minorities experience and not just the feelings minorities express. Also, don't just interview minority employees. You need to also get a representative sample of experience from all people across your company. Why? Because to do something with your data, you're going to need to compare and contextualize your responses. You're going to want to understand how organizational context and intersectionality come into play. Maybe there are some compounding factors. Maybe some inclusion issues are impacting employees outside or across particular groups. You'll never know if you don't talk more broadly. And you're more likely to find underlying problems, issues, or assumptions if you ask people outside of the minority group or marginalized group you're targeting. Honestly, there are so many more things to say about methodology or inclusion assessments in general, but this is getting long enough. Next time, let's talk about what you can improve in your approach to D&I. What perspectives, expectations, timing, and competence do you need and have? And what's currently holding back your inclusion efforts? If you're interested, keep listening, keep learning, and we are going to find ways to go back better with our inclusion and be better companies in the process. Thanks.